Company-wide belt tightening. That's what my boss said while flipping through a luxury catalog, deciding between two sports cars he'd never earned. 3 years of breaking every performance record, and somehow I was the only one who didn't meet the formula. I stood there numb then furious, realizing this wasn't an oversight. This was a pattern. They thought I'd swallow it again, smile again, stay quiet again. But they had no idea the entire system they depended on still ran through one thing only I understood. Stay with me, because what happened next shocked even me. If you've ever been undervalued, subscribe and tell me your story in the comments. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the missing bonus itself. It was the sound of glossy catalog pages sliding under my boss's fingers, the soft whisper of luxury that had nothing to do with the budget crisis he was about to blame on me. I stood in his doorway holding a quarterly performance report that should have been impossible to ignore. Another term of exceeding targets by margins his favorite employees had never even approached, yet he barely glanced at it. He didn't need to. His mind was already made up, just like it had been the past 2 years. When he finally looked up, it wasn't remorse I saw. It was inconvenience. "This conversation is a tough one," he said, the kind of faux sympathetic line I'd heard enough times to predict the next 3 sentences. Company-wide constraints, complex formulas, everyone tightening belts. Except outside the window behind him, the southern sky reflected off the cherry-red sports car he'd driven to work that morning, the one he'd bragged about ordering months ago. Money flowed freely here. It just never flowed toward me. The real humiliation hadn't come today, though. It had come weeks earlier when I stumbled across a folder someone in finance forgot to restrict. Year-end compensation male staff. I still remember the numbers. Elias, 46,000. Connor, 39. Even Mason, the 7-month hire who still needed help logging into half our systems, earned 15. That folder sat in my mind like a bruise no one else could see. I was the one who rebuilt their port routing interface, the one who cut processing delays from 21 days down to 3, the one suppliers emailed directly when something broke, because they trusted me more than the men getting bonuses off my work. But in that office, with the leather creaking under him and the catalog open to another 6-figure indulgence, I wasn't a person. I was a resource, a function, a line item that could be undervalued as long as I kept producing. He leaned forward as if we were partners in a difficult moment. "You're important here. You know that. We're all sacrificing." His tone implied I should be proud of my contribution to this imaginary hardship. Out in the parking lot, Elias's new SUV, bought the same week bonuses were approved, caught the sunlight. I thought about the holiday party with its ice sculpture and the chocolate fountain that cost more than my monthly rent. Sacrifice looked different depending on who you asked. What I felt wasn't just anger, it was clarity. That's the thing people in the comments always ask. Why didn't you leave sooner? Why stay where you're not valued? The answer is simple. You keep hoping they'll finally notice. You keep thinking the next quarter, the next evaluation, the next review will be the one when someone finally says, "We see you." But standing in that office, listening to a man who knew nothing about my work explain my value to me, something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, decisively. He mistook the silence for acceptance, even relief. "I knew you'd be professional," he said, already turning back to his catalog. What he didn't realize was that this moment, this lazy dismissal, was the beginning of the end for both of us. And neither of us knew just how much that end would cost him. Most people think betrayal happens in a single moment, like a door slamming or a sentence dropped like a blade. But mine stretched across 3 years, disguised as polite smiles, performance reviews full of praise, and those carefully worded emails reminding me how essential I was. It wasn't until I opened that forgotten compensation folder that the truth stopped hiding. The first time I saw the numbers, I told myself it had to be a mistake, a mislabeled file, an outdated spreadsheet, something that would make sense once I asked the right question. But the longer I stared at those bonuses, the more obvious it became. Nothing about this was accidental. Their rewards increased every year. Mine stayed at 0, and the pattern wasn't just financial. It was cultural, almost invisible if you weren't looking closely. The meetings where I laid out full analysis only for Elias to repeat my conclusions louder and get credit. The supplier integrations I negotiated that somehow became Connor's initiative by the time they reached the executive summary. The way my accomplishments were treated as expected maintenance while theirs were heralded as breakthroughs. It was a slow erosion, like watching your own reflection fade while everyone insists you still look the same. What people in the comments often ask is, why didn't you call them out? But calling out implies someone is listening. In my case, they weren't. I'd brought up discrepancies before, gently at first, then directly, then with data. Every time I received the same answer. We'll revisit this next cycle, except next cycle never came. Instead, that bonus folder showed the truth. Next cycle was always reserved for someone else. Around October, the realization settled in, not as shock, but as something colder, steadier. By then, the port contracts I'd helped stabilize were at their highest performance metrics. Our turnaround times had improved so dramatically that rival firms sent people to conferences just to hear about our methods. Methods that lived in my head, built on years of manual problem-solving, late-night debugging, and understanding nuances that no documentation could ever capture. That's when I understood something fundamental. They weren't rewarding the people who carried the company. They rewarded the people they were comfortable with. People who reminded them of themselves. People who played golf with them, laughed at their jokes, or fit the mold they thought leadership should look like. I didn't fit it, no matter how much I delivered. So I stopped waiting for fairness to show up. Instead, I began preparing for its absence, quietly, privately. I researched industry roles, not because I planned to take one immediately, but because I wanted to understand my options. Then I realized I had more leverage than I'd ever acknowledged. My experience wasn't generic, it wasn't interchangeable. It was rare, critical, and the competitors knew it. HarborLink's recruiter had been messaging me off and on for months, praising my conference talk, asking whether I'd ever consider a more strategic role with real leadership potential. At the time, I'd brushed it off. Loyalty still meant something then. But now, reading that compensation spreadsheet, I replayed every conversation with new clarity. They saw my value before my own company ever did. I also began evaluating the system I'd built. Every integration point, every supplier rule, every manual override I'd added after a near disaster in year one. The more I studied it, the more I realized how fragile their success was without someone who understood its personality, its dependencies, the subtle timing quirks no textbook could predict. None of this was sabotage. It was simple truth. Systems run the way they're designed, and mine was designed with one assumption, that I would be there. Not because I thought I was irreplaceable, but because they acted as though I was. And yet they valued me the least. That contradiction became the seed of everything that followed. The betrayal didn't end at the forgotten folder. It deepened each time they expected endless loyalty in exchange for selective recognition. They believed I wouldn't leave because I never had. What they didn't know was that patterns don't just reveal the past. They predict the future. And their future without me was already unfolding. Once I understood the pattern, my mindset shifted from endurance to escape, but I didn't walk out impulsively. People like my boss assume that when women leave, it's emotional, rash, the product of a bad day. They have no idea how methodical survival can look when you've spent years being undervalued. I began with research, taking quiet inventory of my own leverage. What did I know that others didn't? What relationships did I manage? Which processes relied on my judgment rather than documentation? The list grew longer each day, and with it, the realization that I owed them nothing. Not my loyalty, not my silence, and certainly not my continued labor. Around this time, HarborLink reached out again, but this time through their COO, Brooke, not a recruiter. She requested a casual conversation, which in corporate language means they've already decided they want you. We met at a cafe far enough from the office that I wouldn't accidentally run into a coworker. Brooke didn't waste time. "Your firm is stagnating," she said, stirring her drink without looking up. "Your numbers are outstanding, but we both know they're not rewarding you. I'm prepared to offer you leadership, equity, and a team." I listened, absorbing every detail, but I didn't give her anything back yet. Not because I was unsure, but because I knew value rises when you don't rush. After that meeting, I took stock of what my company would lose if I left, not as revenge, but as a calculation. Without my oversight, their routing sync engine would rely solely on its automated processes. And automated processes only work flawlessly when real people have spent years quietly correcting the failures. I had done that work every holiday, every late night, every high-volume season where a single misalignment could delay shipments across 3 states. My fingerprints were on every solution, but not in places that executives ever bothered to look. I made a list of personal responsibilities to wrap up. I documented the bare minimum needed for continuity, not the nuances, not the unspoken rules, just what they technically required. Anything more would be a gift, and I was done giving gifts. The next step was preparing my resignation. I wrote the letter 3 times, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted the tone precise, professional, concise, irrefutable. No emotion for them to weaponize, no gaps for them to twist, just a clean exit. Then I reviewed my employment contract, at will, no severance clause, no non-compete that would block a transition to HarborLink. They had given themselves every legal protection and given me none, but the lack of a notice requirement worked in my favor now. I realized then that the power they took for granted wasn't real. It depended on my willingness to cooperate. And that willingness had evaporated. I also backed up all documents belonging to me, my conference notes, development logs from home sessions, supplier negotiation records I'd built myself. None of it was company property. It was intellectual work formed outside their systems, long before they asked for results they never intended to reward. Meanwhile, Brooke kept in contact, each message more confident than the last. When she finally sent the offer, salary increase, equity, signing bonus large enough to make my old bonuses look like loose change, I didn't say yes right away. Not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to choose the day I walked away. It had to be on my terms, not as a reaction, but as a declaration. The last step, strangely enough, was emotional. I allowed myself to accept that I couldn't fix a culture that didn't want to change. I had stayed because I believed hard work created fairness. But fairness isn't a natural outcome. It's a choice made by people in power, and mine had chosen repeatedly to overlook me. Once I accepted that, everything became simple. The timing, the letter, the exit. I didn't know precisely how catastrophic my departure would be for them. I just knew they didn't understand what I really carried, and they wouldn't understand until I was gone, long enough for the first cracks to spread. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning freedom. The consequences were theirs to own. The morning I chose to resign felt strangely ordinary, the kind of day no one would expect to carry the weight of a life pivot. I arrived at the office with my letter already printed, folded once, tucked into my notebook. No trembling hands, no doubt. Just a calm that felt almost eerie, like the silence right before a storm realizes it's about to break. My boss was on a call when I stepped into his doorway, waving me in with the impatient flick of someone who assumes the world will wait for him. He didn't even look at me when he ended the call. He simply exhaled loudly, as though preparing himself for another difficult conversation. "Listen," he began, ready to perform the same scripted justification he'd used for years, but I didn't give him the chance. I placed the letter in front of him. "This is my resignation, effective immediately." At first he didn't react. He blinked, glanced at the paper, then back at me like he hadn't heard properly. "You're kidding, right?" His laugh was sharp, incredulous. "Come on, Dana, don't be dramatic." He expected me to fold. They always do. I set my laptop on his desk, followed by my badge and keys. The soft clink of metal hitting wood cut through the room like a verdict. His expression shifted in stages: confusion, disbelief, then panic poorly hidden under frustration. "You can't just walk out. You have responsibilities, projects, deadlines." "At-will employment?" I said calmly. "I checked. I fulfilled all contractual obligations." For a moment he looked genuinely offended, as if my preparing myself legally was the betrayal, not the years of overlooked work or denied bonuses. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice flattening into something patronizing. "Leaving over one compensation cycle." "Three," I corrected. "3 cycles of excuses." The word hung there, undeniable. His face tensed, but he kept going, scrambling for control. "We can review everything next quarter. Don't throw your career away over emotions." It was almost impressive, the ease with which he minimized my reality. The difference today was that it no longer mattered. I picked up the small box I'd left by the door earlier that morning. A plant, a mug, my conference badge. Nearly 3 years condensed into the things they never valued enough to take notice of. As I walked down the hallway, people glanced up, curious, cautious, but no one asked questions. Maybe they sensed the shift. Maybe they'd seen it themselves and were too afraid to name it. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed with the first missed call from his extension, then another, then another. He hadn't even waited for the doors to close before trying to pull me back, but the moment I stepped outside into the warm San Diego air, I knew I wasn't going to answer. There's a specific kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop justifying someone else's comfort at the expense of your own. I didn't know what would happen next at the company. I didn't know how quickly they'd feel the gap I was leaving behind. All I knew was that for the first time in years, the weight on my shoulders wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was theirs. I didn't realize how quickly the consequences would surface. I thought it might take a week, maybe 2, before anyone felt the absence of the work I used to do, the quiet maintenance no one ever acknowledged but everyone relied on. Instead, the first crack appeared before midnight on the very same day I walked away. By then, I was sitting at my kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand, reviewing HarborLink's onboarding documents. The apartment felt unusually calm. No late-night alerts, no vibrating phone, no frantic requests disguised as praise. Just silence, still and complete. Around 11:47 p.m., my old phone lit up where I'd tossed it on the counter. First a missed call from the night operations manager, then IT, then another unfamiliar number. They called again, and again. I turned the phone face down. Whatever was happening, it wasn't my responsibility anymore. Later, I learned the system stalled during the quarterly high-volume cycle, the one that pushed every contract, shipment, and port schedule through a tight processing window. In theory, it was all automated. In practice, automation depends on human guardrails, the invisible ones built from experience, judgment, and corrections learned the hard way. Years ago, after a near-disastrous holiday failure, I'd added a manual synchronization checkpoint, a safeguard, a moment where someone with actual understanding had to confirm the alignment before the system committed thousands of shipments to transit. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't hidden with malice, it simply wasn't documented in the executive summaries they skimmed instead of reading. They assumed the system ran itself because it had been years since anything went wrong. But systems don't run themselves. People run them, people like me. Without that checkpoint, the entire routing sync engine froze. Shipments backed up, timelines broke. Port partners waited for confirmations that never arrived. At that hour, while I sipped wine, my former colleagues were discovering that clicking the same buttons I'd pressed for years didn't magically produce the same results. I eventually gave in to curiosity and listened to a few voicemails the next morning while making coffee. The early ones were polite, almost casual. "Hey Dana, looks like there's a hiccup. Can you give us a quick call?" Then came the concerned ones. "Dana, the batch is stuck. It can't get it moving. Please check in." Then the ones edged with panic. "We really need you. Contracts are past the deadline window. This is urgent." And finally, the ones from my boss. His voice pitched tight, like someone trying very hard not to sound desperate. "Look, I know you're upset, but you have to walk us through this. Be professional." Professional. The word almost made me laugh. Professional meant giving everything while receiving nothing. Professional meant staying late when no one thanked you, covering failures that weren't yours, stepping aside while others took credit. If they wanted professionalism, they should have tried practicing it themselves. By Saturday morning, the tone shifted from panic to pleading. "Dana, please, whatever you want, just call me back." I didn't. Instead, I went to the gym, bought groceries, cooked a real breakfast, things I'd been too exhausted to do after years of being on call in ways my job description never admitted. Around the time I started meal prepping for the week, I realized my phone had stopped ringing for a while. That was how I knew the problem had escalated beyond individual departments. They were probably in a conference room somewhere, arguing about whether they could rebuild the missing step or somehow bypass it. They couldn't. Not unless they understood why it existed in the first place, and none of them ever cared enough to ask. By Sunday, I got a call from Brooke. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice almost gleeful. "3 of their biggest port clients reached out to us, something about a catastrophic routing failure." I leaned back in my chair, feeling an odd mix of disbelief and inevitability. "That was fast," I said. "Apparently shipments are stalled across multiple terminals," she continued. "Clients are furious." I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel guilty. What I felt was a strange kind of symmetry. They had built a system dependent on someone they refused to value. They'd gambled with their own stability, and the moment I stepped away, the truth revealed itself. They weren't collapsing because I left. They were collapsing because they never respected the person they depended on most. The storm breaking over them wasn't mine. It was theirs. By Monday, the situation had escalated beyond anything I expected. HarborLink welcomed me with real espresso, a clean desk, and a team that actually listened when I spoke. While I settled into orientation, my old phone, now tucked in my purse on silent, buzzed nonstop like a trapped insect. I ignored it. Whatever crisis they were drowning in was no longer mine to solve. But late that afternoon, as I wrapped up a meeting about stabilizing HarborLink's port tracking architecture, security called up to our floor. "There's a man here asking for a Dana Mercer, says it's urgent." I didn't need to hear his name. Only one person from my past job would show up in person. Brooke appeared in my doorway with her brows raised. "Your old boss is in our lobby. He wouldn't say why, but security's asking if we want him removed." For a second, I considered telling them yes, escort him out, let him feel what it's like to be dismissed. Instead, curiosity nudged me. I told them to send him to a small conference room near the elevators, somewhere out of the way. When I walked in, he looked nothing like the man who'd flipped through luxury catalogs while denying me basic recognition. His suit was wrinkled, hair disheveled, eyes ringed with the kind of exhaustion only panic can produce. He stood when he saw me, and the relief on his face was almost painful to watch. "Thank God," he breathed. "Dana, please, we need your help." I took the seat opposite him, leaving the table as a clean barrier. "I'm working," I said evenly. "This isn't appropriate." "Please," he repeated, voice cracking. "The system is failing. We've already lost millions. The board is threatening to fire the entire operations leadership. I'll lose my job." The words should have hit harder, but instead they drifted over me with an odd hollowness. It wasn't that I didn't care. There had been a time when this team felt like family, but that time ended the moment they decided my loyalty was worth less than a year-end bonus. "That's unfortunate," I said. His expression tightened, as if he expected compassion to magically appear. When it didn't, he leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "Don't do this. You're better than vindictiveness." It was almost funny how quickly accountability becomes vindictiveness when it lands on the person who caused the harm. "I'm not being vindictive," I said quietly. "I'm employed elsewhere, that's all." "We'll fix everything," he rushed out. "Bonuses, promotions, anything you want. Just come back long enough to stabilize the system?" The desperation wasn't subtle anymore. I could picture the board tearing into him, demanding answers he didn't have. "You can't undo 3 years of dismissal with one panic offer," I replied. "You valued everyone else. Now you can live with the cost of that choice." His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked genuinely broken. "You're destroying people's livelihoods," he whispered. "This isn't just about you and me. 200 employees depend on that system." I met his eyes without flinching. "I didn't destroy anything. You handed your company's stability to someone you refused to compensate. You gambled, you lost." He closed his eyes, inhaling shakily. "Just tell me what to say, what to admit. I'll say anything. There's nothing I want you to say, I answered, standing. There's nothing I want from you at all. As I left the room, I glanced back only once. He sat alone at the table, staring at nothing. A man finally forced to see the consequences everyone else had endured for years. And for the first time, the weight wasn't on me anymore. It was exactly where it belonged, on him. In the days that followed, the chaos at my former company spread faster than even I anticipated. HarborLink eased me into real responsibility, trusting my judgment from day one, while industry whispers floated through email chains and conference calls. By midweek, it wasn't whispers anymore. It was headlines. Major port tech firm faces system meltdown after key departure. They never printed my name, but anyone familiar with the industry could connect the dots. Old coworkers sent messages that hovered between apology and survival instinct. I didn't answer. I wasn't angry, just done. What caught my attention wasn't the public crisis, but the private fallout. HarborLink's business development team came to me with 3 new contracts, each previously loyal to my old company for years. Their representatives had the same question. Can you stabilize what they couldn't? They didn't care about loyalty. They cared about reliability. That truth had always been at the heart of the work I did, and for the first time, someone was finally treating it as expertise instead of background noise. Brooke walked into my office with the paperwork and a grin that told me she already knew my answer. We secured the deals within days, not weeks. This wasn't revenge. This was competence meeting opportunity. Meanwhile, I heard through the grapevine that my old boss had been fired by the board in what they called a strategic restructuring. Everyone knew what that meant. He wasn't the only one. Entire sections of operations were gutted. People shuffled like disposable parts in a machine they were never allowed to understand. And yet, none of it surprised me. When a company builds success on ignoring the people who hold it together, collapse is never a question of if, only when. One afternoon, while reviewing HarborLink's system logs, I received an unexpected call from Mason, the new hire who'd been there barely 7 months before, earning a bonus bigger than my entire annual increase. At first, I nearly declined, but curiosity won again. "Dana?" he asked, voice sheepish. "I hope it's okay that I called. I left the company." "I figured," I said. "How bad is it over there?" "Bad," he admitted, then lowered his voice. "And honestly, I didn't realize how messed up things were until you left. I didn't get it. I didn't see it." I appreciated the honesty. Growth looks different for everyone, and at least he was trying. He eventually asked if I'd consider taking his resume. I told him to send it, but I made no promises. I wasn't interested in repeating the cycles that destroyed my sense of worth. If he fit, he fit. If not, I wished him well. That was more grace than the leadership he defended ever offered me. A month passed, then 2. My new role expanded faster than I could have imagined. HarborLink gave me my own team, 3 people who listened, asked questions, and treated the system like a living thing instead of a magic trick. During my first leadership review, Brooke asked what philosophy I planned to follow as I built out my department. I didn't hesitate. Pay people what they're worth before they have to prove it by leaving. She laughed softly, nodding. "We brought you on because you understand what stability really costs. We're not making the same mistakes they did." And just like that, I felt the shift. Real recognition, not the performative kind I'd grown used to. One afternoon, at an industry expo, I spotted a familiar figure in the crowd. It was my former boss, standing near a booth for a small consultancy he'd apparently joined. His suit was cheaper now, his posture smaller. He noticed me and looked away quickly, as if proximity alone might reopen wounds he'd long pretended didn't exist. I didn't approach him. There was nothing left to say. The collapse he suffered wasn't my doing. It was the sum of every decision he made while assuming there'd be no consequences. That's what people often misunderstand. I didn't sabotage the system. I didn't orchestrate their downfall. I simply stopped holding them up. Everything that happened afterward was gravity doing what it does when the support beams are removed. In the comments, people ask whether I regret not helping them when things got bad. The truth is simple. Regret belongs to those who made the choices, not to the person who finally walked away. I didn't ruin them. They ruined themselves the moment they decided my worth was optional. And in walking away, I didn't just save my career, I reclaimed my voice, my stability, my future. If you've ever been in a place that mistook your loyalty for weakness, tell me your story in the comments. And if no one's told you this yet today, your worth isn't negotiable just because someone else refuses to see it. I didn't understand how heavy the silence had become until I finally stepped out of it. For years, I told myself endurance was strength, that pushing through dismissal and disrespect made me resilient. But looking back, I see the truth more clearly. My quiet preparation was the real power. Every note I kept, every detail I documented, every small decision to be thorough and thoughtful, those were the things that saved me. When the people in charge refused to see my value, hidden strength doesn't announce itself. It waits, it builds, it protects you long before you realize you'll need protecting. When everything collapsed at my old company, I finally understood how much of the structure they depended on came from the invisible discipline I'd built over time. That realization was sharper than anger. It was clarity, and clarity changes everything. Quiet strength isn't softness, it's strategy. It's choosing to walk away from people who only appreciate your work when they're drowning. It took me years to see that I wasn't powerless. I was patient. And patience, when paired with preparation, becomes its own kind of armor. If there's anything I would tell a friend, it's this. Don't underestimate the value of what you know. Don't let anyone convince you that silence means weakness. And never apologize for protecting the work you've poured your life into. How to get started today. Write down what you do at work that no one else sees. Keep track of who depends on your knowledge and how often. Save proof of your accomplishments before you need it. Prepare options quietly, long before you think you'll leave. When clarity comes, trust it enough to act. What part of your own quiet strength have you overlooked until now?